viewing the live stream can find that link on our SAB webpage by clicking on today's meeting under the heading Meetings and Events, and you'll find the link for that live stream there. So to continue with the administrative remarks, the SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, and the SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on scientific and technical underpinnings of EPA's decisions. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open session, where I, as a DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also provides opportunity for public comments, and there was an opportunity listed on our agenda. We had no public commenters registered to make oral comments to us during this meeting, but there is also the opportunity to provide written comments, and we have received those, and the panel members, it was distributed to the panel, and it was posted on the SAB page. Minutes are also prepared for each of our meetings that summarize the discussions and action items, and those also will be posted on the SAB website. The SAB consists of either regular government employees or special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions, and as such, all panel members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed the confidential financial disclosure forms submitted by panel members, along with other information related to their involvement in the development of materials related to this advisory activity. And EPA has determined that the advisors participating in this meeting have no conflict of interest or appearance of lack of under ethics regulations specified in 5 CFR 2635 related to the topic of this meeting. And as a reminder, I'd like to ask that you put your microphone on mute so that it does not interfere with the discussions. Please feel free to unmute when you would like to participate. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Elian, chair of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shalal, and thank you all for being here and contributing for the July 25th meeting. I know we've also had some comments that were submitted to the lead discussants, as well as some comments that were and a figure that was proposed. Let me just quickly go over the agenda. We will continue our deliberations on the charge questions in the letter to the administrator till about 2:15, at which time Dr. Christopher Frey, the science advisor for the EPA, will provide some clarifying remarks on the draft commentary, Advancing Environmental Justice Science and Rulemaking. We'll do a 10-minute break before we begin our discussion of the draft commentary, which is a self-initiated project, with closing remarks at 4:40 and next steps. And finally, the meeting will be adjourned at 5 p.m. by Dr. Shalal. So with that said, I just wanted to take a few minutes to give a little bit broader comments about some of the distinctions between the report that we are, as the SAB is providing in recommendations to EPA on the technical guidance versus the commentary, which is the SAB self-initiated project. So the technical guidance, the report, is really to assist the analyst in doing the project, whatever it is. Of course, they're all going to be quite different. And I think that Dr. Wolverton, I know a few people were not able to attend the first meeting on the 25th, but Dr. Wolverton provided her slides as well. And I just wanted to to reiterate a few things, a technical guidance, really, one of her specific suggestions was to provide specific data sources, references, and or suggestions when possible. So the idea is really to provide more of a guide. I know it says guidance, so I'm being redundant, but to keep that really in mind. Checklists, specific models, specific ways to enhance the process for the analyst. And I think one other in that same presentation, and Dr. Wolverton, correct me if anything I'm saying is incorrect, but I'm actually looking at your slides now, is to really that some of the things, the broader regulatory process, some of the recommendations went beyond the conduct of an EJ analysis and maybe outside the scope of the technical guidance. So also sort of keeping that in mind, because we have the opportunity in the commentary to go beyond the technical guidance, to think more broadly about things that may be outside the scope. Of course, as the SAB and recommendations and reports, we can add what we think is appropriate outside the charge questions, et cetera. So I don't want to confine us, but to keep those two things in mind, that the commentary and technical guidance report are distinct in their focus. And that may have some relevance to some of the comments and the figure that we will be able to discuss now. I know Dr. Barakal was not able to join us in the first half of the meeting, but did provide comments that were hopefully everybody received by email. And Dr. Shalal also sent out Dr. Wu's figure. So keeping those things in mind. And I also do, again, want to thank, I know some people did provide specific references immediately after the meeting on the 25th. And so, again, that kind of thing is very helpful. So with that said, just as a focus, if we go then to the agenda, where we will go ahead and start by allowing those who were not able to be present on the 25th to provide comments verbally if they so wish to.
I think it would be appropriate for Dr. Barakal to maybe talk about her comments.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I looked over the draft report. I have to be honest, I didn't read all the responses to the charge question with the same level of detail. I have a couple of just edits for charge question 2 and the discussion between Bayesian statistics and frequentist methods. I feel as a Bayesian statistician myself, I want to be not a partisan necessary for Bayesian methods. And so I think it's important that it's highlighted that frequentist methods work fine in certain situations, and Bayesian methods are maybe preferred in situations where we have complicated data structures, in that they lead to a more seamless characterization of uncertainty that is very important to acknowledge. So I will send these written comments to editor. I suggest to charge question 2. And then my other comment was regarding charge question 7, where there was a lot of comments that were geared towards the use of no data, etc., and specific with a big emphasis on remote sensing. And that strikes a particular chord in me, because I guess I've had the chance to interact with data scientists and statisticians that work at JPL and other NASA laboratories, and I'm a little bit more familiar with what is the procedure that is used to generate the different estimates that are derived from remote sensing. And I think many times this data is taken at face value as if there were actual measurements of different variables, when in reality are the output of retrieval algorithm that transform a raw measurement made by an instrument into some derived quantities. And so there is all the uncertainty that comes with the retrieval algorithm itself. Sometimes the retrieval algorithm is not that good. And so there is a revision period during which JPL improves or NASA improves the algorithm, but also the output of these algorithms come out at different levels. And I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that these remote sensing data products come with uncertainty, that depending on what data level we are using, level 1 versus level 2 versus level 3, the amount of post-processing that is made from the raw measurement that the instruments aboard of the satellite is making are applied. And so all these things, I think, needs to be acknowledged, specifically, I think, when there is such a push and a recommendation to use the remote sensing data products. I think if we are suggesting that these are used in an AG analysis, I think it's important that also the uncertainty into these data products are accounted in the AG analysis. And so I would like to bet that to be reflected into the draft report if we're really making a strong statement about using these remote sensing data products. So that was my main comment.
Thank you, Dr. Barakal. Would anybody like to add to that or provide additional thoughts? And Dr. Barakal, you may be the only person, I think there's one other individual who may have been not been present the 25th, who might like to also provide comments. If not, feel free to let us know. So any comments on Dr. Barakal's? I think we've talked about uncertainty before in other contexts, and clearly that's a really important issue. And particularly, again, for an analyst, something that needs to be considered and quantified if possible, or at least acknowledged.
Well, and also, if I can add, sometimes these, I know because I'm actually very familiar with the person at JPL that really pushed for the uncertainty quantification to be added to the data that NASA produces. And so this statistician, her name is Amy Breverman, has really pushed forward for this. And so that is why some of these NASA data product, remote sensing data product, actually comes with uncertainty estimates. So I think it's important that if they're provided, they're used the same way as the census provides some margin of error, right? And the reason why those are provided is because really there is an understanding that those are estimates that are really not observations.
Yeah, excellent point. Would anybody else who didn't have an opportunity like to put forward any thoughts?
I think Dr. Hernandez Ruiz was the only other person who was not present last time. She's with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shalal. I don't have any comments at the moment.
Maybe at this point, we can, I'm not sure if I raised hand or not, Dr. Dux.
I did just have a quick point of clarification. Were Dr. Barakal's comments already sent to us, or they will be coming later? I couldn't find them, so even if we have a date, maybe I can look it up that way.
No, actually, to clarify, I sent an email this morning for me in California time to Dr. Sahar, but Shalal also, but only I think to the question 7 charge question subgroup. So I'm happy to forward to the entire group or have somebody else do that.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I'm looking specifically for charge question 2, the comments that you had on the Bayesian statistics. So
no,
yeah.
those ones are comments I just made on my own laptop.
Okay,
but I'm
got
happy to send the edits.
Okay, thank you so much.
And that would be helpful to provide those to the lead discussants on the different charge questions. And so the members of that group. And I think Dr. Wu's email was sent to the group, but not Dr. Barakal's. So I misspoke there. So maybe we can, well, everybody has the figure from Dr. Wu, but I don't know if it'd be helpful to project it. But the whole concept of community engagement has been part of a lot of our discussions. And so I think looking at a figure like this, it's helpful to see whether or not it will be helpful to include, and whether or not really the technical guidance or the commentary is the more appropriate place. In some ways, thinking about, again, the analyst, this kind of information just about community engagement in general is helpful for that individual to understand what's been done and to really take into account information. The analyst may or may probably will not be actually doing or collecting data on community engagement. There are others who are provided with expertise in that kind of task. So this was something that was again provided by Dr. Wu, thinking about sort of the larger picture. So I thought it would be helpful just for people to provide comments and again, you know, the commentary, which we will discuss later, does have a figure in it already. And so clearly that's something that could be added to the commentary. But what are people's thoughts about the figure? And I know you just got this, so it's a little bit off the cuff to just look at it and provide some thoughts. But we can try to figure out where it might belong and if it's missing or it captures what the panel, the group, thinks of as the meaningful engagement, public trust, and EJ science in general. Yes, Dr. Wu, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah,
Please
thank you.
say a few words about the figure.
Yeah, I appreciated the conversation from the 25th, and this is kind of came to my mind as I kept, as Dr. Troy Abel put it, pleading for figures because I'm a visual person. So this came to mind when we were discussing that pre-letter in front of the response to the EJ technical guidance, the first 2 pages, Roman numeral 1 and 2. And so I thought this fit in with the discussion of those bullets in that first 2 pages of the response back. But also to your point, it does fit perhaps with the self-initiated project. I just thought it would help rather than me constantly trying to verbalize it to actually provide the visual as well. So I wasn't hypocritical about my own, like, I would like to see this. So I tried to mock it up for the committee. Thank you.
I think Dr. Barakal, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ruth, for providing this figure. Can I ask whether the arrows have a meaning, or they're just like the direction of the arrow has a meaning, or they're just there for illustrative purposes? Because I'm trying to understand the public trust going in the one direction, the meaningful engagement going in the opposite direction. Is there a meaning to that? Or maybe I'm trying to read into this, I'm being overly analytical, and I can just not enjoy even artistic figures.
So this is an artifact of me picking a template because I didn't want to make my own graphics. And so I picked what I thought was the closest to what I was trying to illustrate about systems cogs, about like the different parts of the cog having, you know, potentially different labels at different points, but they interchange, like what's advancing in a community might not be advancing elsewhere. But for the overview of the general thought of like things advance with different progress, and it's not a continuum, but sometimes as new parties, entities come into the conversation, you have to backtrack to re-engage, to like move the whole group together to have shared understanding. So the arrows don't necessarily point in the right direction. It is a template. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Actually, if I could just follow up a question, then do you think it'd be more beneficial to remove the arrows or to have arrows with two directional heads, or does it detract from the figure?
Is this a question to me or to Dr. Wu?
I mean, to anybody, I guess, really.
Yeah, I guess for me, I always want to understand whether what is in the figure has a meaning, and so if the possibility of this I don't know what is there even called in English, this I don't know, whatever, these shapes that have the writing inside. If the error can understand that these two things can go in opposite direction, but they can also go in the same direction, then I would make double, arrow that are two-sided. But yes, I don't know if this is a particular deformation I have that I always want to attach a meaning to everything I see, or if this is something that is pervasive among every scientist.
Anybody else? I mean, I kind of do agree, because I certainly, every time I see a graph, I'm trying to figure out what each thing means, so make sure I'm not missing something. And Dr. Jux, I think your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I do wonder about the arrows and if they can be sort of bidirectional. I see a lot of this is, these are iterative processes, even though we know in kind of, rulemaking and decision making, there has to be sort of an end point at some point, but some of this can be iterative. So that's a thought. The main thing I wanted to say is one, thank you, Dr. Wu, for conceptualizing this and for giving us sort of the annotations to go along with the with the visual. One thing that I would add, and it could go either under public trust or meaningful engagement, it's just this idea of transparency. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, having the public to understand or being making sure that that the public is sort of notified around what feedback was actually utilized and what wasn't, or what wasn't feasible to address in the decision-making process. I think that is something that we heard kind of loud and clear, that folks just had an issue with all of the outreach for public comment and for other ways to gather information from stakeholders, but stakeholders not feeling as if it made a difference at all, or if it was even heard, kind of feeling that it was feeling that these processes are sometimes performative and that they don't really mean anything. We definitely understand that not every piece of feedback can be used or addressed, and there may be constraints and limitations, but that transparency, just to acknowledge that it can't be used or addressed in the context of this process, is important. And I think it's just important to call that out, even if to a certain degree the agency feels like it is doing that.
And I know it's a little bit harder for me to see. Dr. Wu, you have your hand up, and I think there may be one other person. Go ahead, Dr. Wu.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Dr. Jelks. I think too that kind of fits with the bidirectional arrows, because I noticed my own typo, but trying to build trust means also trying to re-engage marginalized, disenfranchised groups. But if we continue as a whole to do business as usual, we might make progress somewhere, but then move backward somewhere else. So I do, to your point, see the iterative process about it. And I think that in that way, the arrows can go back and forth. So thank you for that comment.
Are there any other comments or suggestions even about the placement of the figure, or whether we agree as a group that the figure is helpful? And you can certainly provide those comments later if you want time to think about it. Any thoughts about technical guidance versus commentary? If not, I encourage everybody to take their time to read more closely or click on the link and make sure that the whole figure is appropriate and I think that again, it really is many meaningful engagement comments have been made. And so even if the figure weren't included in the technical guidance, there's opportunity to have a few sentences added to know that although it may not be a little bit outside the scope of a technical guidance, that it's really something that's very important that an analyst should be really look over carefully and understand what's been done and make sure that he or she feels that that's appropriate and enough. So with that said, maybe we can stop sharing the slide. It's much easier for me to see the hand if I'm missing anybody with their hands up that way. I think that the last meeting we had gone through all the charge questions fairly well, and I didn't know if people had any other comments they wanted to make on the letter or on the charge questions. I know some of the lead discussants may have received additional comments. I don't know if anybody wants to bring forward any significant comments that were added more recently than what we had in hand at the previous meeting. I'll give you a few minutes. And I believe all the lead discussions are all here today.
Dr. Annenberg is not, but I just wanted to
And
clarify
then a
that-
breakfast with pancakes, scrambled eggs.
Wait. It's earlier out west.
That's right. I just wanted to clarify that the comments that were sent were simply putting in writing what had already been discussed orally during the meetings that we had previously, on Thursday.
Right. And you will have, of course, I'll have an opportunity to see how they're incorporated into the next draft of this report. So I just, again, if there's any comments people would like to add, if they've thought about the letter to the administrator and specifically the bullets, whether those are the most important bullets or they feel comfortable with those bullets. Because this is the part of the report that's probably going to be the most easily read and accessible to EPA individuals. Yes, Dr. Abel.
Yes, sorry everyone, but one of my laptops just went down, so I had to switch. I was on my phone for a bit. I do think I'd like us to consider the addition of more bullets. But I also think it was a good reminder for the parts that I was able to listen to the opening remarks. Is that there's, this technical guidance to analysts versus the other commentary. And perhaps some of these bullets would have a more effective place in that additional commentary, the kind of self-initiated review that we've talked about. But I think probably there's a bullet in here that should address the air monitoring, and maybe it can be incorporated in the data quality metrics bullet. And perhaps that's also another way to think of this, is how could we expand a little bit to capture some of the main points from each of the chapter responses. So I do think there's an opportunity here to add a few more bullets or to add additional language to existing bullets that would better pull from each of the summary bulleted points for each of the response, for each of the charge questions, which really are aimed at each of the different chapters. So I guess just I don't have specific recommendations about that. Just that's how I've been thinking about it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Abel. Dr. Barical, and then Dr. Hernandez Ruiz.
Yes, I guess since I have never participated into writing a letter to the administrator, I guess my question is, in the letter that we're writing, how much, and I guess this also answers the question or addresses the point made by Dr. Abel, are these bullets supposed to be very, summarizing the key points, which to me, the current ones are actually doing that job pretty nicely, and then leaving the draft report, going more into the detail, because I think, data quality metrics beyond accuracy, such as precision, error, uncertainty in data, it's very broad and can cover all the discussion that we've had. And so to me, maybe the letter wants to be concise and just give overall big picture points and then have the report elaborate more in details. I just am afraid that if we start adding more points, it becomes so detailed that somebody might get bored at a certain point and not pay so much attention. I don't know, but I don't know what is the typical standard for these letters to the administrator. So having some guidelines would be helpful.
And actually, Dr. Shalal has probably seen a lot of these letters. I know the ones that I've been involved in, they are about 2 pages. There's no specific length, but I don't know if Dr. Shalal wants to add something before we go to Dr. Hernandez Ruiz.
Yes, I think Dr. Barical hit the nail on the head. It is a fine point between too much information versus too little information. So it is just that we're trying to give a flavor of what the main issues are, and then have the report be the more detailed discussion of why we feel those are the most important issues that need to be dealt with. So, but having a little bit more discussion or fleshing out of each of those, the concern becomes, well, did we include everything that we had concern about in terms of the data? And having a more overarching broad statement would probably capture everything that we talked about, other than just air monitoring that Dr. Abel brought up. So how much is too much is one of those conundrums that we often deal with.
Thank you, Dr. Shalal. Dr. Hernandez Ruiz, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And as Dr. Shalal pointed out, I was not present at the last meeting, so I'm just going through my notes and also hearing that what we're going through this morning is in reference also to last week. So very clear about Dr. Baracal's point about the measurement uncertainty with remote sensing that directly relates to Chapter 7. And I'm looking over my notes. There is one comment from Dr. Abel, and it looks like it is for the air monitoring for Chapter 5, but I do see other, I got the meeting notes from Dr. Elena Irwin, who was very gracious in sending those out. But I do also see other comments that were made here about like demographic data gaps to the proposal to move them from chapter 1 to chapter 7, as well as other areas. And I think that those are mostly for other chapters, but I just wanted to verify the things that should be addressed in chapter 7 for the revision that I will have to collaborate on. So remote sensing, yay, got it. I'm not sure if Dr. Abel intended for that air monitoring to be included in chapter 7. Maybe he can clarify, but I do see directly calling out chapter 7 again is Dr. Chakabury talking about move the discussion of demographic data gaps from chapter 1 to chapter 7, sorry, and the specific data gap from 5 to 7 as well. So those 3 areas of clarification.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hernandez Ruiz. Dr. Abel, and then Dr. Hernandez Cortez.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Barakal, for your earlier comment about how this does capture a lot of, is broad enough to capture a lot of what we'll find in subsequent pages. And I guess I'll just maybe even get into a little bit of detail just to spur our thinking. So in the first bullet, we talk about, it says terms such as intrinsic, extrinsic, chemical and non-chemical factors, overburdened communities, etc. I think we want to use quotation marks around all of the terms that we're delineating that should be clarified. It seems like some are surrounded with apostrophe marks and others are not. And then, we have apostrophe around effects and impacts, single words, but we're trying, I think, in that bullet point to say these are the terms that need to be clarified. So I think all of the terms we want to state here that need to be clarified should have apostrophes around them. And then I think the additional terms that I think warrant inclusion here, I will suggest 2. The first one is structural racism. And another term is equity. So those are 2 terms I recommend we add to the first bullet point. I think it captures terms that we have had extensive discussions about about clarifying those terms for an analyst. And then in the 5th bullet point, further guidance on the use of qualitative data and methods for integrating. I would recommend that we add mixed dash methods to that bullet point, because that's a common scientific term used for when you integrate qualitative and quantitative data, the methods to do that. So those are specific things, and then I have one more that I'll conclude this commentary on, is the meaningful engagement statement. I'd like us to consider expanding, because it says it should be strengthened, including working directly and more closely with affected communities. The including phrase, of course, leaves a lot of other ways to improve meaningful engagement there. But I think much of the participatory social science does talk about how affected communities actually need more resources to substantively participate in these processes. And I'd like us to consider modifying bullet 2 so that it would capture that, because working directly with more affected communities may not achieve equity if those communities don't receive more resources to participate in these, especially in a regulatory analysis by EPA analysts, if we imagine those things happening. So those are some specific things I thought I would share to see how others react if that's useful or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abel. Dr. Hernandez Cortez?
I think the points that Dr. Abel made are really important, and I do not have a comment related to them yet, but I wanted to add one comment related to the points, to the main bullet points in the letter to the administrator. I agree that the ones that we have are a good number and we want to make it succinct, but I do think that there's a few that could be added, particularly in the charge question number 3. We talk about the inclusion of a clear structure analytical guidance blueprint that could give some illustrative examples on how these an EJ analysis can be performed. I think that that point also relates to one point in the chart question 1 related to be more specific about what the analyst is required to do. So I believe that that could be added into the main bullet points, perhaps just as an additional bullet point to the ones that are already there.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez Cortez. So if you have specific wording you'd like to see, that might be helpful too.
Yes, should I send that over to you and Dr. Shula?
Feel free, and if anybody has comments or suggestions on how to revise, absolutely feel free to send those forward. As Dr. Shalal will reiterate, I'm sure everything she should always be copied on, even if it's something sent to the lead discussant or whatever it might be. So
Sounds great. I'll send it now.
other comments about the report or the introductory letter to the report? I would suggest if lead discussants feel that, or people in their group for those charge questions feel that something that is really important that their charge question addressed is completely absent from this 2-page, obviously feel free to bring that up either now, would be helpful just as we sit here and have it in front of us, or as you reread and continue to work on this, thinking through your ideas. No other thoughts? We're a little bit ahead of schedule. I believe that Dr. Frey is here, and he is scheduled for 2:15, but this could be an opportunity to put him on the spot a little bit earlier. And perhaps if there's an opportunity for us to follow up with questions to him, to provide him with a few extra minutes. Dr. Shalal, do you have anything you'd like to add before we move on?
No, that's fine. Dr. Frey is here and he's aware that our agenda is free flowing, and sometimes when we finish one topic, we will move on to the next. I guess as a point of clarification, Dr. Frey, you don't have a presentation as such for us. It will just be your oral comments.
That's correct.
Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sue, and thank you, Dr. Elian, and thank you to the EJ Science Advisory and Review Panel for your public service and the work you're doing to deliberate on your peer review of the EJ technical guidance. And then our topic for now is your work on the self-initiated commentary. And so we're certainly look forward to these sets of advice for the agency. And we also appreciate having had the opportunity to share with you at your March 21st meeting perspectives on environmental justice analysis and rulemaking from across the agency. As you'll recall, we gave a presentation that was co-authored by the Office of Air and Radiation, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, the Office of Land and Emergency Management, the Office of Research and Development, the Office of Water, the Office of Policy, and several of our regions. And then we spoke with you again to continue the conversation at your April 3rd meeting. And I'll just do a little bit of level setting, just a bit of review, and then dive into some thoughts on your draft commentary. So at both the March 21st and April 3rd meeting, we shared some contextual information. It's important to this agency that science supports decisions. The agency is active in conducting EJ analyses across the whole of EPA. From this experience, we've been learning about the need for flexibility and tailoring of approaches. We discussed previously that data, tools, models, and approaches are evolving, that decision contexts vary with regulatory context, and that decisions need to be made under various constraints, including time, budget, available information, and statutory or other legal constraints. Ideally, we would like to develop and apply tractable and parsimonious approaches, also in part because we need to be able to communicate what analyses we did and what the results mean to various audiences. Across the programs and regions, we identified and shared with you a number of science themes, and I'll circle back to those in a few minutes. So in general, we welcome your advice relevant to the conduct of scientifically rigorous environmental justice analyses to ensure that our rule development rests on an up-to-date and scientifically rigorous understanding of the public health and environmental risks facing communities that the rules are intended to benefit. And some of the considerations that we're interested in include the analytic process, the steps, the components, approaches, and considerations. And as we talked about, and we had some interactive conversation on this in the April 3rd meeting, is where feasible, specific, concrete, actionable advice is helpful. And one of the themes of what I'll share with you in terms of our thoughts on the draft commentary is helping us understand how to do things and what resources are available to support those things will be helpful. And then also prioritizing or tiering of advice is helpful. And this can also include your sense of the timing, like are some recommendations thought to be implementable in the near term, or some of them more longer term. Are there particular timeframes you want to posit and bin the recommendations into? If so, that would certainly be helpful on our end. We also, in reviewing the draft commentary, inferred, and I think this hopefully is a common understanding, that it seems to be aiming for a fairly high-level document. And so we perceive that in so doing that you're providing us with some pointers. Generally, it'll be helpful where possible if you can cite examples that illustrate how the pointers can be operationalized in practice, or that demonstrate the insights that they provide and how they can contribute to EJ analysis for national rulemaking. Also, we're aware that you're working on, two related but different tasks. One is the self-initiated commentary, and the other is the peer review of the EJ technical guidance. And it's our observation there is some crosswalk between those two things. And there might be, for example, topics that have been addressed in detail in the peer review, but that are the foundation for comments or advice in the commentary. And it would be helpful to us to have a crosswalk between those. So to the extent you could point to a crosswalk, relevant, more specific recommendations from the EJ technical guidance that are the basis for the same line of thought in the commentary, that would be helpful. And I've been listening to the conversation in today's meeting and really appreciate the thoughtfulness about thinking, are there things that, perhaps are longer term recommendations that emerged during the peer review activity that you might consider either specifically referencing in the commentary, or it sounds like you might be thinking about moving some things from the peer review to the commentary. Of course, that's entirely up to you, but that all sounds very reasonable. Something that would be helpful to us in the commentary is, your thoughts on a list of critical elements to consider in an EJ analysis, or if you feel that that's addressed in the EJ technical guidance or in your peer review of that, that might be an example of where there could be a crosswalk. So I have a couple of sort of lists of things to go through, just to give you some more specific reaction. So in general, as I hinted at, it would be helpful to us for the panel to point to or cite, illustrative examples or perhaps even idealized examples to kind of illustrate what's behind many of the recommendations. So I'll go through some examples. So, are there examples of highly impactful public engagement trainings or courses that we can use, to bring our staff up to speed on some of the recommendations you have related to engagement? And based on your experiences, what methods have been successfully or perhaps not successfully used for engaging with the public and building sustainable community participation? And what barriers have been encountered, either in your experience or based on the literature? What recommendations could be offered or examples provided regarding community engagement along the lines of a framework that's approachable for a wide variety of staff, program offices, timescales, and budget limitations within the agency? Can panelists recommend or describe recommended target audiences for these engagements, and what methods have been used for outreach and developing those engagement? And again, here positive outcomes as well as cautionary tales could be informative. Are there examples? There seemed to be a theme of having structured screening phase. It would help to know a little more what you have in mind for that. And perhaps that's a cross-reference to the peer review activity, or perhaps it's in addition to that. But are there examples of a structured screening phase analysis that might inform the creation of the systematic approach that we infer that you're recommending? We note the language in the draft commentary about participatory or procedural justice, or correcting injustices, participatory and procedural injustices. Are there examples of an assessment that focused on systematic assessment of those injustices, or ways of correcting those injustices? What metrics and methods have demonstrated success most convincingly to the panel? How will we know if we're doing these things well? And we noted with interest the panel recommendations regarding daytime exposures, and would be grateful if the panel can provide citations for national data sets of daytime that would support that kind of daytime exposure assessment. So those are some kind of general comments. I've got a list of some very more specific comments, and so I'll kind of walk through those. And then in closing, I'll come back to the science themes that we talked about on March 21st and April 3rd. So some of these are comments on specific pages and lines of the commentary. And so some of them are very specific and detailed. Some of them are more general. So on page 1, line 24, there's a phrase of regulatory impact assessment. And we would recommend that be regulatory analyses, which matches language in the new circular A4. On page 2, on lines 27 to 28, the committee recommends the preliminary or screening phase of an EJ analysis have more structure. And it would be helpful to us to understand your thoughts on more explanation of that structure, what you see as its key elements, and how one determines how to make the decision for moving from a preliminary or screening analysis to a more detailed analysis, or if those things are covered somewhere else, a cross-reference would be helpful. Also on page 2, toward the bottom on line 35 and on to the top of page 3, there's some mention of open data standards. And if you're not already aware, you may find helpful information regarding EPA's open data policies, which is available at a website, and I can provide the link in the chat when I'm done speaking. It would also be helpful with regard to open data standards, and given what seems like a significant consideration of engagement by the panel, to recognize that engagement with communities and tribes can entail various considerations that may limit open sharing of some kinds of information. So for example, personally identifiable information, confidential business information. There may be studies, legacy studies that have involved human subjects where there's conditions where not all of that raw data can be shared. And then, prospectively in working with communities, there likely would be community data agreements or tribal data agreements. And so it would be helpful to, recognize these issues along with the open data. And also a recommendation from us, or just a suggestion really, is that with public access or open data, metadata is perhaps equally important to the data itself, because that provides the context for the data and helps others to appropriately interpret and use it. So it would be helpful to us to see some language that points that out. On page 3, there's a number of great suggestions in the commentary, including data from states. And if you have any specific recommendations on how to encourage or solicit more useful data sets from states, or if you know of such data sets, it would be helpful to give those as examples. That's on line 1. On line 7 to 10, there's a statement there that might be, I don't know if it's asking us to help you identify barriers that we see, but we can offer some. If it's a request for EPA to identify barriers, then some examples would include regulatory schedule, availability of staff and or contract support in the time available to do an analysis, funding for rulemaking requirements that are non-statutory, and knowledge of community contacts, and how to really initiate the engagement with the community under the various time pressures that are often faced in a rulemaking context. Also on the same page, on line 29 to 32, there's a recommendation such as the use of statistical methods for identifying hotspots. Keeping in mind, and this is some of the conversation we had in the first couple of meetings, is the analysts who would be doing these kinds of, or the people who are doing these kinds of analyses are likely not going to be statistical experts. So in order for us to implement a recommendation like that, we would have to likely develop tools and tutorials and training materials. So if you have any advice or recommendations from your experience on how best to do that, that would be very helpful for us. Moving to page 4, on line 3 through 17, the need for mixed methods approaches is addressed in the context of tackling scale-dependent differences. It'd be helpful to us to have a little more clarity on, in that context, what you envision the mixed methods would entail and how these approaches could be applied in a regulatory or rulemaking context. So for example, a recommendation for how site-specific analyses could be utilized in national scale evaluations or rulemaking would be appreciated. And just generally, because we have a great interest as well in mixed methods, anything you can do to discuss the applicability of mixed methods based on examples, including pros and cons and situational applicability, would be very helpful for us. Moving a little bit down the page to line 8 to 12, there's some language about different sort of spatial resolution. Something that at least some of us are thinking about is, would the use of census block groups be a more refined approach than census tracts, and what opinions, in terms of like practical ways of doing analyses, would you have to guide those types of choices? We infer that the panel is suggesting that the agency provide both regional, national scale analyses alongside hyper-local analyses. And especially the latter would be heavily dependent on local data availability, and therefore, either in some sense not always feasible, or maybe not feasible with the same coverage of, say, indicators as the national scale analysis. Anyway, any thoughts about how to match those when there are gaps, and at what point are the gaps so large that it maybe isn't indicated to do that? Moving down to line 26 to 29, there's some discussion about, when looking at an area of interest, and then the comparison point should be everything outside that area of interest. So kind of, I think what's referred to as the inside-outside approach. That approach is not necessarily the current default in the available tools. And so it prompts a question about, do you have recommendations for determining when that is really essential, versus are there situations in which that approach is not as necessary? So the simpler approach being that, we look at an area of interest, and then we compare it to everything else, including that area of interest. And there is obviously some overlap there, but when is that overlap, I guess, problematic? On page 4, toward the bottom, and onto page 5, there's some discussion of statistical tests of significance. And I also note this issue is raised in the draft peer review. And illustrative examples would be helpful, as well as some critical discussion of potential pitfalls and limitations. I'm sure you all know this probably as well, if not better than I do, but estimation of statistical significance is based on some underlying assumptions. For example, that there's randomly sampled representative data, and the use of appropriate or robust statistical estimation methods. And I saw an acknowledgement of this in the draft peer review, but I think we're all familiar that the American Statistical Association has cautioned about the use of tests of statistical significance. For example, they do not measure the size of an effect, and they don't measure the importance of an effect. And so, for us, this prompts, questions about, are there factors in addition to or other than statistical significance that we could consider in drawing conclusions regarding differences, and particularly whether those differences are, quote, important, unquote, in the context of a particular regulatory action. And then the last specific comment, and then I'll turn to the general themes. On page 5, the panel refers to the use of causal inference methods. And this term may have context-specific meanings, and thus it would be helpful to clarify what is the causal link that is the focus of that comment. I'll also just point out, we deal as an agency with causal inference in a variety of contexts, and one that you may be familiar with is the causal determinations that we make in the context of the scientific review of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. In 2022, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine issued a report on advancing the framework for assessing causality of health and welfare effects to inform national ambient air quality reviews. And that National Academy study critically reviewed and evaluated the weight of evidence approach that we use for causality determinations. So that may be relevant to your advice on causal inference methods. And I can provide a link for that when I'm done speaking. So that's some, reactions that our group had, and basically the same list of folks who were on the title page of the presentation we gave on March 21st. So certainly appreciate your consideration of that feedback. We also, request that the panel consider providing advice regarding the science themes that we identified in our March 21st presentation, or if you feel that that's addressed in the peer review, or that there's other places that that's already addressed with citations, that would be helpful. Those science themes were things where we really are looking for external expert advice to inform choices that we make about EJ analysis. So this includes, for example, what are the series of decision-making points about the EJ analysis itself, including, how do we evaluate and select data, tools, models, and approaches? How can we consider, represent, or scale local concerns in a national context? Recognizing, I think it's pretty self-evident that, there's probably a limited number of community engagements that could be done if we think of a very intensive, rigorous form of community engagement to support a rulemaking in the time frame available. There's perhaps other forms of community interaction between EPA and communities. And so how do we kind of match all those things together? Another key thing is, what factors are important in a given context, and we refer to parsimonious models. This may relate, for example, to the use of sensitivity analysis to help figure out which inputs or indicators or metrics in an analysis are important, which are not, to kind of avoid a paralysis by analysis scenario of trying to model everything everywhere all the time. Which stressors or types of stressors to include and how to represent them, when and how to incorporate social factors and how to incorporate or capture social vulnerability, the temporal and spatial scale and how to deal with data gaps, methods for combining impacts, and then a little bit of this is addressed in terms of mixed methods with qualitative and quantitative data, but we're definitely looking and very interested in advice on that. So with that, I'll stop, and again, thank you for taking on this important task. And I'll also note a few of the members of our group of points of contact to support your efforts are here. So I don't know, Dr. Alion, if you want to do some Q&A, and I may call on some members of my team to support that if you do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think this is a good opportunity. That was a lot of information that you threw at us. And so people may, and of course, it would be wonderful to have some of that down in written form so we can catch some of the things that we missed. But I think a lot of the points you made are really important on the specificity and really providing the advice for EPA to be able to put things into practice. So with that said, I would definitely open it up to the SAB panel to ask any questions that Dr. Frey and again, reminding us about the previous presentations that were made, that we do have some materials from those presentations too, that we can always go back to refresh our memories. Yes, Dr. Barakal.
So I wanted to, unfortunately, I didn't write everything down because it was a long list to keep track of. It keeps on adding and adding. I just wanted to comment on, I think, 3 things. One is the statistical significance. By one side, I'm actually somewhat fearful that the commentary that was published on the Journal of American Statistical Association about p-values sometimes get misinterpreted as the fact that statistical significance is not important. I think when that commentary was published, the key point was that many times in scientific publication, the p-value was the reason why, oh, you don't get to 0.05, so now this effect is not significant. And many times, you know, research efforts were not published because you didn't get the significance level. But I think the comment was not that, yes, maybe we shouldn't be obsessing over p-values, and maybe instead of having this, you know, threshold of 0.05, look at confidence interval still, you know, but I guess the point is, like, you still have to quantify the uncertainty and basically make conclusion in the face of uncertainty. And I don't want that to be misinterpreted as we shouldn't do any reporting of statistical significance because there was that commentary. You know, I just am afraid of the interpretation being literal and that not being taken into consideration, because we need to make sure that point estimates are not treated as the truth. And when we want to make decision is based on the recognition that there is uncertainty in the sample might not be representing the whole population, and, you know, the estimates we obtain have standard errors and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second question, I think it was like, when should we make this differentiation of in versus out? So sometimes in spatial statistics, when you want to find hotspots or clusters, the idea is you compare the value of an exposure in an area versus what is outside. And so I think if the context is when trying to find the regions where there is an elevated exposure or an elevated risk, then it does make sense to do this analysis on inside versus outside. And I think that's the main scenario. I can envision that. And then I do agree with you about the comment that you made about causal inference and basically trying to make causal statements. I think that particularly in an environmental scenario where the data is not independent and there is a lot of interference, the causal inferential methods don't necessarily translate that easily. And so I sometimes feel that now everybody wants to talk about causal relationships, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that causal inference, particularly in environmental context, is quite difficult to make because we're often working with observational data where there is a lot of dependencies. And so I don't There are people that have developed causal inference methods for air pollution studies, Francesca Dominici and her group, but I think it is not that straightforward to implement. And so recognizing that oftentimes the analyst doesn't have this tool bag that is so extensive to cover all the different types of statistical expertise, I think that may be something that is more on a long-term goal. And definitely, I think what I realized from your comment is that there needs to be more effort from other communities in generating tools that could be used by other people. And I don't know how we can try to emphasize this translation of statistical methods into tools that can be implemented by other people. But that's definitely something that is needed. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Barakal. Dr. Abel?
Actually, I'll defer to Dr. Sad. I don't think we've heard from Dr. Sad today. I don't know how the order of the hands going up, but
Okay, how about Dr. Wu, I think is next, and then Dr. Sad.
Yeah, so to the points that were framed by Dr. Frey, I appreciated the complexity and also did not catch all of it. But to the point that it resonated with me was, you know, trying to build out that short-term and long-term and thinking about, you know, states or regions or localities that might actually have some examples on how to build out that framework of what's short-term and long-term. And so being in California and working as the risk assessor with communities, I get the sense that, you know, certain things don't transcend jurisdictions well, but certain things, perhaps like science, can transcend the jurisdiction. And so the example I have with that is ethylene oxide. As one pollutant, you know, it's used in major sterilizing facilities across the country. And to the extent that we know as scientists, it's a carcinogen and should try to, you know, limit and mitigate that pollutant. The one chemical paradigm does not serve communities well when there's multiple pollutants and problems to address. And so just trying to build on, you know, what can be addressable short term is, you know, clearly what we know. And then building out in our last conversation on the 25th, talking with Director Loneflight about some of the indigenous knowledge that, you know, I think to the point that what Western science characterizes as qualitative data, working with communities of all kinds to incorporate what is maybe outside the scope of traditional Western science, but still very valid in terms of some of our more rural lands and you know, reservations and so forth, working with tribal communities. So I also see that as a short-term goal to incorporate more of the qualitative data with the quantitative that we know. And then just being the nerdy scientist that I am, thinking about how we advance science of mixtures and exposures and understanding that, and then filling that in as the science develops, so to speak. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Dr. Sad, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the detail of Chris Frey's presentation, and I look forward to seeing that in written form so we can address all those details as best we can. But you mentioned a couple of things that are related, and I just wanted to respond to quickly. One was the concern that a statistical procedure that's selected may not be appropriate to the data because of the assumptions of that statistical test. And the other was the difficulty of doing hotspot or spatial statistical analyses. I just wanted to mention that using the ArcGIS suite, ESRI has a rich variety of spatial statistical tools in the toolbox for that purpose. And also the educational resources provided by ESRI has great training that would help analysts come up to speed on the various tools and tests and how to use them. So I think that's not something that EPA has to develop on their own. just has to take advantage of what's there.
Dr. Abel, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I too agree that we got a lot of information and I'm looking forward to seeing it from Chris Fry. And I also just want to clarify that I think many of the, especially when it came to the science themes that you mentioned in your earlier presentation, I'm trying to maybe do a compartmentalizing here. I think a lot of what you were asking for seems like it would fall into the self-initiated review, although you did have some specific comments about our draft response report. So I think I just probably need some help making sure we are separating those. But am I generally correct that the science themes that you identified and much of your earlier presentations was in fact looking at this self-initiated review?
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, Dr. Hernandez Cortez.
Thank you so much for all of those detailed comments. I think they are very, very helpful. I just have a clarification comment about the causality comment you mentioned related to this National Academies chapter that was shared with us in the chat. Is your suggestion for us to think through how we recommend the causal analysis in the SIP, taking into consideration how the EPA thinks about causality as reflected in the link? Is that your suggestion or your comment?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say I'll answer it this way. So, I mean, first of all, I wanted to share awareness of that in case there may not have been awareness of it, particularly that report, but also that report is about a practice that we've had in the agency that's also been reviewed by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee through multiple iterations of multiple air quality standard reviews for multiple criteria pollutants. And I know that because I'm a past chair of the CASAC. So that speaks to a weight of evidence approach to causal determination. And so I think part of it is the awareness of that's something that the agency has done and has had reviewed by other external expert peer reviewers, both in terms of EPA federal advisory committees and also the national academies. Whether it's, to the extent it's relevant to your advice, I personally don't have a clear, I don't think I know enough about the context of the comment about causal inference in the draft commentary to make that connection myself. It kind of just encouraging maybe a little more context on what's behind that statement. And then if you have recommendations for approaches, we would offer that, given some of the characterizations that other commenters have made, about some of the challenges of the data that we're working with in EJ analysis, that there might be a role for a weight of evidence approach, but we would certainly welcome your advice and thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments?
If I may, Dr. Alian, I want to, I think the example that, sorry, I'm looking at Dr. Sad gave about, for example, that ESRI has, some, a rich, variety of tools and training. That's exactly the kind of information that would be really helpful for us. And so, yeah, that's a perfect example of, maybe a little bit more specificity of how we can do these things makes a lot of difference. So really appreciate that example.
And I want to thank you for the obvious, and your group for the time and effort they put into reading the commentary and providing all those suggestions and input. And I think it brings us back just again to the how-to, the specifics, sort of what you were just saying, because that's going to be the most useful. And the more general comments, I imagine you're probably all have heard many times or are well aware of and have thought through things yourselves to try to sort through. But I'm sure members of this group could have such great expertise in different areas, can try to supplement with some of those specifics, tools, methods, approaches, and where there's areas that there's still discussion on, that's also good to point out, because it's not obvious that this is the better way to do it. It could be very dependent. So to state that as, and what doesn't work, back to Dr. Barakal, just because P doesn't equal this specific number, that's not the end of the story.
Very good.
I didn't know if anybody in your group would want to comment. Not that I'm maybe stepping outside my role here, but I know they were very helpful in the presentations earlier on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you offering that. I certainly, I support anyone from EPA who wants to add anything. So that would be wonderful.
And I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I see Dr. Barakal has her hand up, so while folks are contemplating, go ahead, Dr. Barakal.
I have a question. I don't remember actually if you had mentioned something about wanting also to think about how to gain some information or more expertise on how to do community-based engagement. Was that one of your comments, or did I misunderstand it?
Yeah, so we, I mean, we noted that topic, and yeah, some of the things, you know, in terms of, are there examples of highly impactful ways that we can do training of our staff to do public engagement? That's one theme. Another theme is, you know, what methods for engagement would you recommend as being how to do it that are likely to lead to success? And are there cautionary tales of what's not successful, or you know, pitfalls to avoid? You know, also keeping in mind that you know, the folks in the agency, you know, while we have, you know, in say the research office, we have some folks who may have deep expertise. We also have practitioners who may be learning and doing these things for the first time. And so, you know, anything you can advise regarding a framework on how to, you know, approach community engagement. And maybe it's a resource that's already available. Maybe it's trainings that are already available. You know, considering the different background and preparation that, you know, different staff would have, and that we would be doing this across different program offices and on different timescales, and with, you know, to be honest, with budget limitations. You know, so how to do this in a practical way, but that's effective and meaningful. You know, of course, the agency does have a meaningful involvement policy, and you know, as an agency, we're thinking about community engagement in lots of different contexts. But you know, anything that's specific to the context of, you know, how to do community engagement that provides the data and information to inform EJ analysis and national rulemaking would be very helpful.
Yeah,
but I'll also, I may clean up my written notes a little bit, but I'll share those so you'll all have the benefit of the more detailed list that I read from.
Yeah, I was asking this question because I didn't know whether, you know, of course, the NIHS funds a lot of this center, and I think I just looked up how many of community-based engagement centers there are across the United States. And there are several, of course, not many in the middle of the United States, in the central state, in the, but I was wondering what that could be also a resource like EPA working with NIHS and the community-based centers that NIHS funds, and see they have always engagement core. I know myself because I used to be at University of Michigan in the School of Public Health, and one of the EPA person in your team, Trish Coleman, was very involved with the community-based engagement center at University of Michigan. So I think some other university might have that expertise. I don't know whether it would be useful in the sense of regulatory analysis, but maybe that's a possible avenue to collaborate with those centers.
Yeah, well, and of course, we also through our STAR grants program, which is not as not as highly resourced as NIH's grants program, but we do have a number of active STAR grants where our grantees are doing direct engagement with communities. I think one general thing with grants is, of course, those are investigator initiated, investigator led, and where there's opportunity for collaboration, if that's something that the grant team is interested in, I think that can happen, but we cannot direct grantees to do specific tasks, just given the nature of a grant.
Dr. Abel, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll try to get my video on here. I do have some thoughts that I wanted to share with Dr. Frey about examples of mixed methods, much in the vein of Dr. Sad's direction to ESRI training. On the mixed or on the meaningful engagement, some of the legal scholarship that I've looked at and have recognized as kind of important for this actually points to one of EPA's programs on how you do how you get resources to communities to do meaningful engagement. And the one that I've seen reference, and one I'm familiar with because of my work here in the state of Washington, is the technical assistance guidance or technical assistance grants to communities near Superfunds. So this is actually resources, monetary resources that are given to communities to create a tag group to help the community engage substantively with Superfund decisions. To me, I think that does exemplify how you do meaningful engagement beyond just working with affected communities, but getting resources into affected communities. And so that's one comment I'll make in terms of guidance. The other one is on the mixed methods, and maybe I should alert that I may put Dr. Annenberg on the spot, but on the mixed methods in the social science world, I think Jason Seawright's book that I think I've shared with, but we'll share again, called Multi-Method Social Science Combining Qualitative and Quantitative Tools, does have some different examples of how you do mixed methods using quantitative data to then identify a focus on an outlier case. And it seems like that might be a good framework for thinking about a national level analysis that's quantitative. And then how would you then go to a qualitative case study to delve deeper into and to to deepen the regulatory analysis. And one of the reasons I thought about that connection was because of Dr. Annenberg's previous presentation about the new paper that they published, which I've had a chance to look at, and I've also had a chance to actually download the data and use it in ArcGIS to look at Seattle communities and how they where they were landing in essentially a census tract using satellite data of air pollution. because of the problem with our air pollution monitoring system, this is a really intriguing step. But I thought about, as Dr. Annenberg presented, there was a moment, I believe, and hopefully she can clarify here, but where they identified a certain percentile of census tracts that are in the top percentiles, right? So that's how you would use a quantitative analysis like Dr. Annenberg's publication to then look at the high percentiles. The other example is if you try to use EJ Screen, you'll get a percentiles by each index. Where does a area, a census tract, sometimes a census block fall within the various EJ indexes, where you combine a social metric like non-white population with hazardous air pollutant metric. So you have this kind of social and biophysical combination. But it would be really interesting if, I thought about this with EJ Screen, but if you could actually map all the census tracts, for example, that land in the top percentile of both a social indicator and an environmental indicator. I think that might be the way to think about an approach to mixed methods that actually could be implemented in a regulatory analysis if there are resources to then provide to the community for that engagement. So those are some of my specific ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, that all that sounds, I mean, at least from my individual personal perspective, those are very compelling and sounds very operationalizable and practical and helpful also in spanning the question, as well as how do we deal with, you know, the need for local place-based information, but also in the context of the national rulemaking. So it's touching on that as well as a mixed methods theme. So yeah, I think those kinds of suggestions would be extremely helpful for us.
Yes, Dr. Annenberg, go ahead.
Just since I was called out there, I'm just kidding. Thank you, Dr. Abel, for using our data. And I agree, that's exactly the type of use that we feel that it's valuable for. Satellite data, as Dr. Frey and many of us on this call know, are not necessarily fit for regulatory purposes, for all regulatory purposes, as they don't represent ground level values. But when we combine it with other data, we can deduce what's happening at the ground at across large spatial scales or even small spatial scales. But we're likely also potentially missing things, which is why the qualitative data and other quantitative data sources are so important. You know, as a screening level cut, these types of quantitative data sets can be extremely valuable, and I'm pleased that satellite-derived NO2 is now included in EJ Screen as of a few weeks ago. I want to suggest another approach to, in addition to Dr. Abel's, I think Dr. Abel is suggesting a mixed method approach to use the quantitative data to identify areas that should be, that ripe for a deeper dive. Potentially also qualitative data, though, can be useful to identify areas where quantitative data break down, where they're not covering all of the necessary factors that could be affecting communities.
Any other comments or questions? If not, Dr. Frey, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I thank you for the engagement on these issues, and again, we really are looking to you for your sage advice, because you are the experts. And But yeah, anything you can do to help us also see how we operationalize it. So, not just the what could or should we do, but also the how can we do it, would be really helpful. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm just grateful for all that you're doing. And, on behalf of the team, I know they didn't jump to speak when Dr. Elion, you offered that opportunity, but on behalf of the team, we really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. And we look forward to having some written notes so we can make sure we have the opportunity for things that we may have missed while you spoke. That'd be terrific.
All right.
Well, at this point, we have a break scheduled. So Dr. Shalal, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add before we take a 10-minute break.
I just wanted to make you aware that we do have the slides, the presentation slides from our previous meeting that Dr. Frey had shared with us, which list out some of the science issues that he wanted addressed or for the panel to attempt to address. So we can certainly project that and maybe go through it a little bit after we come back from break.
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll break for 10 minutes and we'll be back at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
An hour. You're just eating now.
We were shopping. There's a big difference.
Yeah, shopping requires energy. And
Okay.
focus.
Please put your
Put that in
microphones
the
on
back.
mute. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we can get started, and I think Dr. Schlall, you will put up some of the presentation that we got early this spring. And hopefully people have read through the commentary. I did want to read something specifically out of the letter, which says the commentary on line 8, page 2, I guess, that this commentary conveys some general suggestions and recommendations for advancing EPA's EJ analysis to ensure that the impact of these assessments and regulatory actions in the rule development is based on conceptually valid, scientifically rigorous, and empirically sound approaches, and utilizes latest developments in geospatial data, tools, and technologies. So that's actually pretty specific charge in some ways, getting back to, of course, what Dr. Frey is talking about. And I think Dr. Schlall, if you go ahead, some of that will be reiterated. So trying to keep those things in mind as we have the next hour and a half, 40 minutes to discuss as a group the commentary.
So here's are the slides. If you could advance them, Will. Keep going. One more. Okay, so here are some of the cross-cutting themes that are discussed, and then continue, Will. Across the programs and regions, the following science themes emerge. So these are the science themes that Dr. Frey was alluding to, and that he requested some of our feedback on. Continue, Will. A few more. Continue. One more. And so these are the sort of the list of various issues. So Dr. Elion, I'll let you decide where you want to start.
Yeah, I guess also just reiterate how to do these things and what tools are available and specific examples. So I don't know if people have general comments they'd like to make, but we can look at the commentary and see it's basically, I mean, the first page is really more introductory material, and it's not until the line 13 that some of the specific recommendations are made. So I don't know how people would like to proceed, whether going through the specific recommendations, whether to fill in some of the gaps that we may have in terms of what EPA is seeking advice on. Yes, Dr. Barakal.
I think what is really difficult is that, of course, this is very wide, right? We're talking about all possible policy regulation and thinking about EJ concerns in the vast, realm of all the rulemaking. And I think there are certain areas where we have better information than others. So, I'm thinking again, like the case of air pollution, certain pollutants, we have a wealth of information, and in other contexts, there is not the same level of advances, both from the statistical methodology and from the data availability. And maybe we want to make our recommendation conditional on the data that is available and the information that is available. Maybe make that clearer in the commentary. I don't know, give some general rule of thumb in that direction. That's my first reaction as I'm thinking about this.
Actually, that's a good suggestion. I mean, it certainly could be two examples where you have the data and the steps you might take based on an example like air pollution, and then what steps would you have to take if you don't have really being all the way to not being able to do anything, or could you do some with greater uncertainty? Some more specific example of, in that case, what would you do? How would you address it? Yeah, that's a very good point. Are there other comments or thoughts? I know some specific data sets were suggested. There may be, people may know specific methodological tools, even to some of Dr. Frey's questions about examples that of community engagement that didn't work well, that to illustrate things that were not successful. Yes, Dr. Wu, go ahead.
Yeah, building off of Dr. Baracol, your point of using air pollution as the example, that is the media that I also work with, and the complexities that are complex mixtures of different categories of pollutants, being criteria air toxins and toxic air contaminants, which are commonly known as hazardous air pollutants. I think when I saw this list way back, a couple months ago, and now that it's refreshed in my mind, I see part of these bullet points fitting in with that schematic feedback loop that I shared earlier. And to the extent that, doing chemical risk assessment one at a time is not getting us much of it anywhere, but at the same time, where we do need community generated participatory science in terms of, communities wanting to engage and help monitor some of their own air pollutants. And I'm thinking PM 2.5 that specifically comes to mind. Although being a complex mixture is still, we do know some general health outcomes of it, but to move beyond that feedback loop of needing more data, but then doing something meaningful with it about, whether we use better retrofit control technologies or air filtration or those things, it does help identify for what community, what particular pollutant of exposure or also lived experience that might fit into that non-chemical stressor contributes to poorer health outcomes in certain communities compared to others. So I kind of continue to think back on how iterative this needs to be to fit into that schematic. And then also as the science advances of understanding chemical mixtures and also the qualitative lived experiences, that's how we make that iterative process move forward.
I think also just to maybe have people think about the community engagement piece. I think in some of the previous discussions, there was people had specific suggestions, and I'm not sure that those were captured in this commentary. Dr. Anwar, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Yes, sorry I have my video because my Wi-Fi is not as strong where I am. But I piggyback on what Dr. Wu and I can't remember the other person that mentioned on these bullets on filling the gaps, the data gaps. On the 25th when we met, there was a lot of discussions on how some of those data gaps could be diminished or accomplished. And EP, one of the ones that I can come to mind, especially for air quality monitoring. Dr. Abel also mentioned water quality monitoring as well, but specifically for air quality monitoring, the EPA toolkit, they have the air sensor toolkit that is currently available, and that has been very useful for gathering data in some of the areas where they don't have a national data monitoring system. So that is something that could be included in the report, because there's evidence that is all being used and is very impactful. Also, the National Tribal Air Association is an excellent example of how they have done their on monitoring and have provided information to EPA and other entities. And it helps to understand what is going on in those rural and overburdened communities. And I thought I should mention that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anaruo. Yeah, important points. Dr. Annenberg, go ahead.
One of these bullets is highlighting for me something that we could write more on, which is processes and rationale that underlie analytic decisions. Unless I'm misremembering, since I read the document, our document, I don't remember a piece on documentation and transparency and providing rationales for decisions. That can really go a long way, especially when, you know, we don't have ideal data, there are data gaps, or there are limitations. Just providing complete documentation really does go quite a long way into improving trust and transparency. So that's one comment. And I would say that that documentation should be throughout the process of the entire EJ analysis, from scoping to, you know, communicating the outcomes. A second point I have is about figure 1, and this goes back to a discussion that Dr. Elian, you and somebody else raised, and I can't remember who it was, but about if you have great data, then you can go this route, and if you don't have great data, you can go this other route. And that is reflected in figure 1, but they're both these arrows are going to the same box at the bottom. And I just wasn't sure whether that conveys what we, well, does it convey, what does it convey? If there's 2 different pathways here, there should be, I don't know, maybe we're ending up in 2 separate places. We can't end up in the same place, or maybe we can, but I would like to tease out what we mean by those 2 arrows going to that same box at the bottom of that figure.
Mhm.
And now, sorry, since my hand is still raised, I'll just note that at the right-hand side of that figure, we do have documentation of limitations and assumptions. That's wonderful. It would be also valuable, I think, to bring that forward in the text.
Yes, Dr. Barakal, go ahead.
I think also building on what, so we have been discussing the data, and that's a key point because of course any analysis will require data and information. But I think also building on what Dr. Frey was mentioning and thinking about the analyst, we also have to think about what methods are implementable with the skills and the tools that are in-house, right? And so I think maybe there should be a step where, besides understanding what type of data and information is available, there is also a scoping of the literature and an assessment of what of these methods are actually implementable easily, like that doesn't require somebody to develop code, or maybe there is statistical software available to perform those analyses. And so I think this also should be documented, again, in the face of transparency, right? Somebody can say, these are the analysis that we would like to do, looking at the literature, these are the methods that people have proposed. However, these methods cannot be implemented because of this and these reasons. And so this is the type of analysis that we carried forward, so that there is an acknowledgement of the type of the methods that we implemented, the limitation that comes with having implemented maybe a simpler analysis, and in some cases, maybe implementing a simpler analysis with available software doesn't produce any significant changes in the results, but at least that is documented, building on what Dr. Adamer was saying about the transparency. But I think, we have talked about so much about the data, but I think it's important also that the same type of documentation and the same type of attention is based also on the methods and why the choice of certain methods versus others, and what is the informed decision that led to the choice of one method versus another.
Thank you, Dr. Barakal. Ms. Lewis, go ahead, Ari.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm in the car, so I hope it's not too loud. This is, I think, to build on that as well, because I think this has been rattling around in my head for a while. We have focused a lot on sort of data inputs, how to gather information from the community, and also just maybe other possible data sources that are out there. And one thing that's a little bit missing for me, and I don't have an answer right now, it's just something I think I'd have to think through myself as well, is what is the actual output? So we have talked a lot about the input, but not a lot about what the output is, and then how that output is actually used to make a specific decision, which is, the decision is going to obviously vary a lot about what sort of regulation and what we're talking about. But maybe if we could think through more, like, what are we getting out in the end, and how then that's going to be actionable. That's sort of something that's, I think, a bit missing for me at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point, and also thinking it through the eyes of an analyst and what you're moving toward. Absolutely, what's the output? Do we have other comments? Dr. Annenberg?
Well, I think that question of what's the output is a really critical one, and we went there, I think, in the review of the technical guidance when we were talking about scoping the analysis. What's the outcome that the analyst is intending to produce? And we gave some examples of what it could be: reducing the, I'm giving some examples now, reducing the health burden overall for everyone, narrowing the gap between the most overburdened and the least overburdened, reducing the overall spread, the variation in the health burden. There could be a lot of different ways to look at it. And the analysis that you would do depends on what that outcome is that you're attempting to say something about. So to me, that I'm not sure that's necessarily something we want to predefine for EPA, but should be something that the agency should do each time it's doing an EJ analysis. Maybe there's reason that it would be different depending on the regulatory context and the analysis. I wanted to raise one other idea, which is Dr. Frey was asking for specific examples to take this into a more tangible space, and I can completely understand why that would be valuable. Maybe one approach would be to give an example of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards because there you have a disaggregated process with clearly delineated functions and outputs of each technical support document. So you've got the integrated science assessment, the risk and exposure assessment, the regulatory impact analysis, and each of those has a different purpose. And if EJ were brought into each one, there would be a different output that was intended for the EJ analysis, depending on which document it was. So for example, in the integrated science assessment, maybe that would be a review of the literature on how much that air pollutant varies by population subgroup. In the risk and exposure assessment, it would be what is the a new analysis done by EPA staff on the environmental, the distribution of the pollutants and their health burdens. And then the regulatory impact assessment would be an analysis of the impact of the regulation, the proposed regulation on those disparities. So each of those regulatory support documents is doing a different thing, and therefore the goal of the EJ analysis should differ depending on what step of the regulatory development process they're in. So that might be one example to say, okay, in the context of a risk and exposure assessment, here's what an EJ analysis might look like. In the context of a regulatory impact analysis, here's what an EJ impact might look like. And it's not just the output that differs, it's also the tools and data differ, because in a regulatory impact analysis, you might need some kind of modeling or estimation tool to do a what if hypothetical scenario of the implementation of the policy, whereas the risk and exposure assessment is really more, an analysis of present day conditions.
Thank you, Dr. Annenberg. That's a really good point. And then when you think about some of the areas where there's very limited data, how do you then proceed in that kind of approach? Another approach might have to be, developed totally differently. So those would be great examples. We have other comments people would like to make? It is so different by, we've had a lot of air experts and with a huge amount of information to share. And I know that they're equally across EPA. It's just so difficult across all the different groups to be able to make a commentary and a short commentary that can help really address all those analysts who might be in those different groups. But if anybody has anything they'd like to share, in addition, please do. I will say, even in this slide, it's really a lot of it is about the data and sensitivity, uncertainty, and how we handle the data and different aspects of data. There's one definitions and concepts is kind of in this slide that's sort of this an outlier. I'll use a data term to identify it. But beyond the data, there's a lot of the representation of community concerns, but via selection of metrics and indicators, which is again sort of a data aspect. So I don't know if in this discussion there were other slides, not that I recall. This was really the summary slide about some of what was presented. That's outside of of course, the scoping question is outside of the specifics of the data and the data gaps, et cetera. Dr. Annenberg, go ahead.
I had one question about something that I don't think we've talked about yet, which is the EJ impacts of climate change and the way that those get brought in the regulatory context around greenhouse gas emissions. Or don't, the way they don't get brought in. The social cost of carbon values are right now a one number value essentially, with no disaggregation to it that enables one to do an EJ analysis of the benefits in terms of avoided climate change. How much do we want to comment on that here?
Do people have any thoughts about that? Dr. Saad, go ahead.
I guess my initial answer would be none, because the uncertainty associated with different sorts of climate effects is so great, and the spatial variability is so poorly understood that I think it introduces more confusion than value. Just my position.
Dr. Barakal.
Yeah, I would say maybe, and as an example where we still have a lot of uncertainty and not much is yet known. But I also think the commentary should be again, it should be very broad, right? And I'm not necessarily climate change is the only environmental justice concern that we have. And so I think we can take it as an example of a situation where the data is still, the output from climate model is a very large spatial, it's very coarse, and there is a lot of uncertainty. All the projections that have been made kept on being, we were too optimistic. Things are actually different from what we projected. So I think as an example of a situation where there is a lot of uncertainty can be brought up, I just wouldn't focus it necessarily just on that.
Thank you, Dr. Barakal. Dr. Wu, go ahead.
I think I'm gonna err on the side of devil's advocate on that. I think Dr. Annenberg brings up a very good point in the sense that, for the self-initiated project where we have more space to make more, I guess, suggestions, recommendations, it seems to fit at least in that space where we can uplift that the communities that are most impacted by climate change issues, whether it be sea level rise or, wildfire smoke or other climate change stressors and pollution, that those are the communities we're really supposed to be addressing with the environmental justice science. So I think that it's worth noting that it's a good point to include in maybe the scientific self-initiated project.
Other thoughts? Yes, Dr. Barakal.
I guess it seems like it's an example where we could strike a balance between being cautious and use it as an, try to make everybody happy, where we don't make strong statements, but at the same time, we understand that there is something that is important to take into consideration. I don't know.
let me go back a little bit to the commentary itself. And I think based on Dr. Frey's comments, there may be changes, obviously, and more specific information added, and perhaps Dr. Wu's figure added to this. Do people see that there's a huge, any type of real, something that we've just left out? We can add in a few details to what the structure is that we have set up for this commentary. You know, if you go through the sort of the topic sentence of each paragraph, in terms of what the SAB is recommending or suggesting, you know, screening phase. This is starting on page 2. Is there anything that we're really basically missing? I mean, the first recommendation is to develop clear definitions. And I guess there could be some help about where some of those definitions are already have been made, or there's certainly some states. I think we go back to how do we get, if there's opportunities for states to provide support for any of these kind of bullets, or and then things like this on page 2, the last paragraph, that the EPA be more structured. It doesn't exactly, again, say how, whether community inputs are needed. I mean, that's pretty broad. How would one determine whether more community input is needed? The following page, page 3, developing detailed guidelines. And I guess, again, if we think about how you get meaningful involvement and how you get equal access, and of course, we're saying that there isn't consensus, so some of these don't have an answer or an obvious, all you have to do is this, or, you know, step 1 or step 2. So I guess what I'm trying to encourage is that if everybody could sort of go through this commentary looking at those paragraphs, or whether or not some should be removed and others added. It's a little more specific on page 3 about, again, looking at different data that might be appropriate, and where those data are held. Not just that it's from a daycare center or a prison or a hospital, but if people actually can provide support. And then again, we get back to sort of the EJ screen problem, where you want nationally consistent data, or in these cases where it's appropriate to go to the more local scale, depending on the scoping question, what you're trying to get to, which some people have brought up today. And then we have the environmental risk social vulnerability indicator. So that's a more specific. Dr. Chakraborty, I see your hand up. And again, so I'm just sort of trying to think about how to go through this to make sure that we're really catching what we really think are the important points. Go ahead, Jack.
Thank you. I was also thinking how best to address some of the comments we received from, I think it was Ann Wolverton and last week, and of course, Chris Frey today, in terms of examples of, since I guess you're discussing this particular paragraph, some of the sentences that I had written earlier, and how to provide specific examples that the agency is looking for, that they can actually use in future analysis. And that applies to this commentary as well as the draft report we are collectively writing. And I guess my question was, are we just going to add like links to data sources, or should we also describe them, also provide examples of articles where those data sources have been used specifically for environmental justice analysis? I guess how far to go in terms of in the length and level of detail for the data sets as well as their applications for EJ analysis in the published literature. I just wanted to hear any thoughts and comments that you may have in terms of how best to address those questions. Thanks.
Do people have have thoughts on that? I mean, personally, I was worried about just having a link because the links can get broken and then you're kind of lost. So you need some kind of additional information, in my opinion, the source of the data and a short description of what the data hold. But do other people have thoughts? And I just to follow up a little bit, I mean, obviously the report is a lot longer so that you have the opportunity there to go ahead and add fairly deep, significant details on it. And but still, I think very briefly, enough information can be provided in the commentary to really assist the EPA.
And are we allowed to refer to the report in the commentary? I wasn't sure of the sequence in terms of when they'll be shared and approved by the SAB and published.
Yeah. Hey Jay, if y'all don't mind, I'll jump in on that. Yes, and I think we all heard Chris invite you all to even crosswalk key points and point to each other. As far as their timing, they'll be tracking together. Up to the point where they're together in quality review. And to the extent that it's possible, I'd like to see them finalized together as well. So that's kind of my vision for the finish on that.
Okay, that helps. Thanks.
Sure.
So are there next, go ahead, Dr. Barakal.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking, again, this is something that I've been starting to think as I was listening to Dr. Frey, and it's this recognition that I've always had that, the research we do in academia is much different to what happens in a policy, in a regulatory framework. At the same time, I think it would be great if all the methods that we develop in research would be accessible to people that are working in the regulatory world. And I know that more and more there has been a push to make sure that there is methods that allow for reproducible research. But I don't know if this belongs into this document, in this documentary, whether there is a way for EPA also to kind of encourage for this type of activities to happen more and more. But again, I don't know if this is a recommendation that EPA can have, or like this has to be more, a concerted effort of EPA as long as all the other grant funding agency. But it would be great if in some ways it is communicated that, in order for the research that we do in academia to translate and be applicable in a rulemaking context, the tools need to be available and accessible. And I'm not sure that where that message can be conveyed, and whether this document should be the place where this message is conveyed. I don't know.
Well, are there any more comments?
Well, Marge, I'll just jump in. I don't know the total answer to Veronica's question because it's partially your all's choice to decide what goes in and out of these recommendations. So it's really your choice. But I will say that the purpose of having a self-initiated project separate from the guidelines was to pick up topics that didn't fit well in the guidelines and that might be more future forward looking or something out of the box. So I would say in general, without answering your question, I don't, it's up to you all to decide what's in and out, but you should be thinking broadly in the guidance. I mean, in the self-initiated project, and just maybe more a little narrowly in the guidance. One's a peer review, one's a thought piece.
And I guess I would maybe add to Dr. Barakal's, when you think of the analyst and all the training that that individual is going to need to have, I mean, where does that training come from and how does it available? Just the same tools on the data side, the same question pertains to, you know, other aspects of the job for those individuals. So that might sort of be part of the same thought.
Yeah, in some way, I think this is my perspective based on what Dr. Brennan said. I mean, I feel that this is something that we all should be aware of, and somewhere this comment has to be made, right? And if it's not made anywhere, that it would never be becoming more widespread as an acknowledgement that there is this gap. And so maybe if we can do whatever we can do to try to reduce this gap and make sure that this tool and how to implement this tool and how to use this tool in the right way is made more publicly available so that we put effort in that direction. I think I don't know, of course, this is my comment. So of course, I'm going to say I would like to have it in the document, but in the commentary. But I would propose that we think about that.
Thank you, Dr. Barakal. Appreciate your comments. Anything else? I think we could, and Dr. Schlall, please jump in if you'd like, you know, thinking about some of the questions that have been brought up and what the next steps are to try to incorporate. We should get Dr. Frey's more specific comments. I know he needs some time to, as he said, to clean up his remarks a little bit, but that may help us to reread the commentary with those specifics in mind. So those of us who have something that we can add, either examples or as we've been discussing, specific references, tools, or the lack of tools, or you know, some of the challenges that could be added. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. There's time for each of the lead discussants to, you know, continue working on the main report, maybe with some of what's been discussed today about the commentary in mind, that, you know, that could be bridging. It's okay if there's some overlaps in those two documents. And I'm going to let Dr. Frey go ahead and speak up, because the chats, not everybody has access to the chat as easily as others. So please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question about, you know, and I, you know, I'm also, my background is academia. You know, what can academics do to make their research more relevant to the needs of mission agencies? At the Health Effects Institute, which EPA co-funds, at their last annual conference, had a session that was along this theme. So I think it's a conversation that's well worth having. And, you know, it's completely up to you whether you put this in your commentary or not. But I just wanted to let you know it is something we're also thinking about, how to get the message out and how to figure out how to just let folks know, you know, if you only had done this or only had done that, we could have used your study. But in the absence of that, we couldn't. You know, things like that. But then, you know, also the translational aspect of science, which is, you know, something in the Office of Research and Development, we think a lot about how do we translate the science to support our partners in the program offices in the regions, states, tribes, and communities. And so I know some academic researchers think a lot about that, and they do great work, but not all do. And so, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. How do we get to that? I don't have all the answers, and we may not have authorities to require it, but it's definitely a conversation worth having. And anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Wu.
Yeah, I think in light of this recent, conversation started, in my mind with the point that Dr. Annenberg brought up about, the climate stressors and the communities that are facing the, frontline impacts of these climate change and environmental stressors at the same time being the same community, essentially. It does iterate that point of, Dr. Barakal, I do appreciate you're bringing up where and how do we put this in. And I think that points more and more to the self-initiated project, that if we bring it up, it's a recommendation that we as this advisory panel see the need to, mention it. And then that iteration and transparency helps that conversation go. And then more awareness grows. And then the more awareness grows, more engagement grows. And that starts the ball rolling.
Well, I don't see any other hands up, but I do want to give everybody, I know some people have not had the opportunity to speak. I want to make sure everybody's who has something they'd like to contribute has that opportunity. So we'll take a minute to just let people think through some of their comments or thoughts. And of course, I know we've received already a written comment by email. It doesn't have to be right now. I don't want to put people on the spot. There's time to really think through. There's been a lot of material presented today. Well, maybe at this point, then we can think about next steps, if everybody's okay with that. And Dr. Shalal has specific dates that, what the next steps will be. So would you like to go ahead and I guess a few people are not here today, and others joined today who weren't available for the previous meeting. So all of this will also be an email, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. So following today's meeting, either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, you should be receiving an email from me that will sort of outline the dates for various milestones. I am going to try to create a document that I can share with everyone, where everyone will have access to the editing of that document. So both one for the report, the peer review report for the technical guidance, and another for the commentary. But first, I think that our first deadline will be next Monday, which I believe is August 5th. And I would like to have everyone's sort of additional comments that they want to include within either the report or the commentary. So just simply sending those along and CCing the lead discussants. The work, excuse me, of the lead discussants will not begin until basically August 6th, once we've collected all of that information. And then at that point, you will have access to the documents, the shared documents, and you can insert your edits, comments, additions, deletions, whatever the case might be, into that main document. And you'll have about a week to do that. And so after that is done by the lead discussants, then, the rest of the panel will have an opportunity to look at the edits and the comments and make sure that nothing was left out or was not relayed in the way that was intended, and to make those corrections. And then hopefully, so within about 3 weeks' time, we should have a document that has been revised and includes all the new edits and new comments from everyone. At that point, I will take possession of the documents and just simply work on formatting and making sure that they are done in the usual format that we use here at SAB. Dr. Elian will also have an opportunity to look at the document and make any final editorial changes. And then I will share the document with everyone, making sure that everyone concurs on that document in its form at that point, and then we can transmit it for the quality review for later on this year. Dr. Hernandez Ruiz.
Yes, hi, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, making sure I'm understanding the instructions. So you would provide one centralized document for everyone to be able to put in their comments and weigh in regarding the conversations that we've had today and last week. And then the lead discussants are supposed to start helping making those changes. My question regarding those changes are, I've heard some suggestions about moving sections from chapters, like 1 or 2 to chapter 7. And so I just want to make sure that I understand how you want those to be handled. I don't necessarily feel comfortable with just taking one comment about removing something from a chapter and inserting it, for instance, in this case, chapter 7. So I guess just looking for guidance on that is indeed how you want us to proceed, the lead discussants that are supposed to be making these edits.
Yes, well, like I said, you'll be receiving comments from panel members by August 5th. So August 6th, you'll have basically the instructions about what changes need to be made to your particular question. And so whatever those thoughts and ideas are, yes. And if you need help, I'm happy to assist you in doing some of that stuff if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself. So
I guess
yeah,
I'm
I
okay
can.
Incorporating, sections that might be missing, right? But when it comes to maybe deleting sections or taking sections from other chapters and inserting them in certain question that belongs, for instance, in this case, under my responsibility to edit, that's what I run into. Should I be doing this, right? So definitely I'll be reaching out to you for some guidance on this.
Sure, no problem. And by the way, I think the document, you will not, I guess, remove anything from the document because it will be a red line strikeout. So if things, if folks disagree and want to keep certain items within a particular section, they still have that opportunity to reject whatever edits occurred. So it's not like we're going to completely lose anything by doing that.
Thanks for the clarification, because that was actually making me a little bit nervous.
Yeah, I'll be sure to turn on the edit red line strikeout ability on that options. So anyway, I mean, I know there's a lot of information and hopefully we'll also be receiving Dr. Frey's comments in written format, and I can share those with you. And you can think about the kinds of recommendations that you would like to add to the current documents. And please let us know where you want your comments to be included, whether it's in the report or in the commentary. And if it's within the report, which question it fits best in. And so so that the lead discussants can actually know how to, implement and incorporate your suggestions. Any
Are there-
questions?
Yeah, any questions on the next steps or any part of this process?
Okay.
Well, hearing none, I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's perfectly fine. And we also got a little extra time with Dr. Frey and asking questions, so that was also very helpful.
Yes, and I thank everyone for participating and I look forward to completing this report. And thank you all for all the great ideas, and so I've really enjoyed hearing the discussions. So I'm sure that EPA will benefit very much from all the advice.
Thank you all for all your contributions and your future contributions to this project. So I'm looking forward to seeing the comments that you all come forward with based on what we did today and on the 25th.
Okay, so with that, then we will adjourn our meeting and look forward to the offline discussions. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.